Creepy Campfire Stories. I didn't mean to leave the trail. The forest had thinned into bony birch and low pine, the sky cooling to the color of old steel, and the map on my phone insisted I was still on the red-dotted loop. I kept glancing down at the pulsing dot like it could read my intention. Cabin, tea, light, a book that didn't smell like damp wool. The dot blinked back indifferently. A gust came, dry leaves rattled like a chain, and I saw it. Just a dark seam at the base of a limestone shoulder, smudged by saplings, easily missed unless you were looking for a place that swallowed light. It felt like a mouth. I told myself it was a curiosity only. A quick look. 10 minutes. The woods breathed different around caves. Even before I ducked, I felt the cool stream of air on my cheeks, breath coming out of the earth. My headlamp cut a cone into the seam and showed me pale stone, a scrape of old soot near the lip, and a scatter of bones too small to be anything that mattered. That was what I told myself. Rabbits, squirrels, the little tragedies that keep the bigger predators fed. I went in. The entrance chamber had squat stalactites like teeth and a floor that sloped toward a pinch in the back. My breath fogged white in the beam and then drifted away. The forest sounds, wind combing the needles, a jay doing its broken hinge scream, slid off the stone, and the only sound left was water saying plink, plink somewhere I couldn't see. I took a step. Gravel hissed under my boot. Somewhere deeper, the plink echoed back as if my step had made the drip. I looked back, just to be sure, and saw daylight compressed into a narrow gray card between rock. It looked ridiculously small already. I could turn around now. The cold air smelled like old pennies and crushed mushroom. I stepped again. I'm not reckless. That's what I told myself as I pulled the small camp stove from my pack, set it near the entrance, and warmed my hands over the blue flame. I'd been lost once before in the wrong kind of dark. I'd learned that fear, real fear, is a series of decisions made too late. So I made decisions early. Extra batteries, chalk to mark the way, string to tie from rock to rock, a headlamp and a spare in my coat. I wasn't going to be a story someone told later about the person who wandered in and never came out. When my fingers thawed enough to feel, I took the chalk and drew an arrow pointing to the slice of light. Then I made tea in a battered metal cup, the steam smelling like mint and iron. I sipped it while the cave breathed past my ears, and the drip kept time with my heart. Calm pooled around me, heavy and soft, and for a moment the cave was a room I could live in. A place where nothing beyond my beam existed, where everything noisy and petty about the world stayed outside. Then something moved behind me. It was small, the sound of gravel shifting and a whisper like hair on cloth. I spun and let the beam rake the entrance. Empty. The gray rectangle hadn't changed. My stove ticked faintly and the steam from my tea had grown thin. I told myself something settling, stone does that. But when I turned back, my arrow on the wall was smudged, a powdery smear like a thumb pressed through fresh chalk. I hadn't touched it. Wind, I said out loud, because I have never liked to be the only creature making noise in a quiet place. Draft. The word went out and came back thick and late, every consonant softened, as if the cave were tasting it. Draft. I watched the chalk arrow until my eyes stung. It stayed as it was, ruined and vague, good enough if I needed it. I drank the rest of my tea and decided to look into the pinch while there was still light outside to send hope into the cave. The pinch was just big enough to slide through sideways. The stone was cool on my jacket and damp. On the other side, it opened into a chamber taller than my beam, the ceiling gone into the black like the throat of a well. The lamp made little coins where it struck calcite, and the drip was louder here. I found its source, a seam in the stone, water gathering and letting go, plinking into a shallow pool wobbled by unseen things. Something else wobbled, not water. Something in the air like heat. I moved the beam and caught a curtain, no, a net, of hair-thin threads anchored to the stone. They were almost colorless, only the slightest pearl sheen when the light hit them. They were arranged with a grace that made my teeth ache. Spirals and radiating lines, loops within loops. My first thought was spiders, a city of them. But there were no spiders, not even husks. I put my finger near the net without touching it and felt cold radiate off it, then a kind of static tickle like a hand reaching from the other side of glass. I stepped back. My boot found a rock that wasn't there before and slid. I caught myself on a bulge of stone. My lamp skittered across the chamber, briefly lighting the opposite wall. That was when I saw the prints. A row of boot prints arcing across the damp stone. Tread like mine, size like mine. They led from the pinch to the far side, where the dark bent and seemed to offer a path. Relief and confusion struck at the same time. I hadn't walked there, and yet the proof of me had. My mouth tasted like mint and iron. I swallowed. "Hello," I said. The cave sent hello back to me, off-tempo, too slow, syllables unbuttoned and done up again wrong. Something in my own voice, flattened and stretched. It slid over my skin and curled in my ear, as if trying to nest. I stood there until my knees began to cramp. Listening makes you crazy fastest, so I moved. I followed the prints, because the alternative was making my own path, and my own path would fail me sooner. The tread marks were fresh enough that water had collected in them and not yet gone to stillness. They were spaced like a careful, cautious walk, my gait when I'm thinking too hard about not falling, and they angled toward a darker seam at the back where the chamber narrowed again. As I walked, the drip behind me slowed, then stopped. Silence pushed on my eardrums like altitude. Then, faintly, a new sound took root, a tapping far down the passage in a rhythm too steady to be accidental. Tap, 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 tap. It sounded like knuckles against stone. It sounded like someone patient. I had a thought then of 10 minutes ago, of my casual promise to myself. I wanted daylight back the way you want water when you've been thirsty too long. I stepped, and the tap stopped. "Hey," I said, bright and sharp. "Is anyone there?" There was a pause as long as I held breath. Then my own voice said, less bright, too smooth, "Is anyone there?" The cave had trimmed it, softened the edges. I took the spare lamp from my jacket and clipped it to my shoulder so that I threw two beams forward like a car. I felt better instantly, less tunneled. The air changed again. Mint and iron gave way to raw earth and something sweet, like bruised fruit. My light caught moth-colored things on the floor. Mushrooms, half-spheres and little fans, layered and layered until the stone vanished beneath them. I stepped gently between them. When the light ticked off their skin, the undersides gleamed faintly. It wasn't reflection. It was their own pale light, a ghostly greenish white that seemed to turn the stone to bone. A slow breath rose, the whole passage inhaling as one, then exhaling. The hair on my forearms lifted. The mushroom fans shivered as if stroked by a careful hand. The tapping resumed ahead, faster now, tap, 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 tap. I should have turned. I should have followed my chalk smear and my memory of daylight. But the prints continued, and my chest had tightened into a hot fist, and it felt like leaving would be failure, and I have never loved more than the feeling of not failing. I slid through the narrowing passage. Stone brushed my sides and my pack hissed. On the other side there was another chamber, lower, with a ceiling like the inside of a rib cage. I could almost touch both walls if I stretched out my arms. The tapping was to my left now. I pointed both beams that way, and there it was. A person stood half in the dark, turned slightly away. A jacket like mine, the same matte green. Shoulders sloped the way mine slope when I'm tired. No headlamp on their head, no light at all, and yet I could see the profile, ear, cheekbone, a line of jaw. They were looking into a crevice as if listening for something tiny. I saw their breath make the faintest cloud. "Hey," I said, relief washing me, careless and warm. "Thank God. I thought The figure turned. It was my face. It wasn't. It was what the cave had heard from me and arranged, too smooth, too neat in the wrong places. The eyes were mine, but they didn't reflect my light. They drank it. The skin was a little too pale, not in the way of someone unwell, but in the way of new stone. On the chin, a whitening bloom like frost or filaments, threads. The tapping moved. It was not from the figure. It came from inside the walls, inside the stone, a many-fingered sound like teeth clicking in a deep mouth. The figure, my double, made a small smile that I recognized from mirrors and photographs as the one I give strangers when we pass on tight trails. My double raised its right hand. I raised mine on instinct. We both had the same small nick below the thumb from the same clumsy kitchen knife. I rubbed the scar when I'm nervous. The double's fingers simply hovered over it, as if remembering the gesture without understanding it. I said. "I," it said after me, half a beat late, as if the earth had to chew the sound before spitting it back. It stepped forward. The filaments on its chin lifted, tasting the air. When it spoke again, it added a word I had not said. A word that was not quite a word. Home. I took a step back. My boot hit a low mound and slid again. This time I fell, hard, both palms scraping damp stone. The light jumped crazily and splashed the ceiling. In that scatter I saw what I'd missed. The ceiling was not just stone. The threads I'd found earlier were everywhere, weaving in and out of the limestone like veins. They thickened above the crevice where the double had been listening, braided into a pale mat that pulsed, slow and sure, as if breathing through the rock. Mushroom fans grew from it in little shelves, and between them something wet flexed, a lipless opening. It exhaled. The air blew across my face, warm and sweet, and my mouth filled with the taste of rot and honey. Home, my double said again, but the voice was not my voice. It was the cave's. My sounds poured through its throat. It reached a hand to me. Its skin was colder than stone, unyielding as glass, and the threads at its wrist gently unfurled like new roots. They touched the back of my hand. They touched, and in the touch I felt something without words, a broad, patient attention, a hunger too big for teeth. I yanked back, and in the same motion my other hand found my pack. I tore its zippers, stupid with fear. I found the flare at the bottom, last year's reckless purchase after a friend's winter hike turned into a night on an unmarked trail, and yanked the cap off with my teeth. The sulfur hit the roof of my mouth bitter and hot, and for a second my jaw locked. Then I struck it. Light erupted like a newborn sun. The chamber became a negative of itself, all shadows hard and crisp, all stone glowing. The threads recoiled, curling tight. The mushroom fans shriveled to wet rags. My double screamed. It wasn't a sound I recognized. It was a tearing cloth, a cave swallow swarm, everything leaving at once. It flinched back, and the threads on its face blackened and broke like hair in a candle flame. It reached again anyway, unstoppable as mold. The lipless opening above it opened wider, an O of tissue, and something clear rippled out like a sigh. I swung the flare, wild, a comet's tail of sparks. Where fire touched, the white mats blistered and turned the color of tea. The threads on the wall smoked. I shoved past the double, if I didn't touch it, if my clothes didn't catch, into the passage. The flare hissed in my hand and threw my shadow in lengths I didn't recognize. Behind me, the tapping turned to pounding. The cave, I thought, with a logic that made me giddy, had an immune system. I ran. Each narrow scrape that had been careful going in became a set of teeth going out. The flare's hot heart licked my knuckles and my skin went tight with the burn. My shoulder hit the doorway to the tall chamber, and my spine popped. The plinking had returned to its bowl as if it had never stopped. I saw the net of hair-thin threads and whipped the flare across it. They slumped and melted, and a smell like cooked mushrooms bunched in my throat until I gagged. My headlamp sputtered. A drop of something had hit it, or maybe the heat was too much. It flickered twice and died. The flare was all I had left, a spear of furious orange that shrank as I watched. I moved faster. I reached the first chamber, the one with the chalk arrow. My stove sat where I'd left it, cold now, a tiny metal monument to a moment when I thought I had control. The chalk arrow was gone, not smudged, gone, as if the wall had licked it clean. In its place, faint and almost shy, a series of loops like delicate handwriting traced the stone, spirals within spirals, the language of the threads. The flare made a sound like breathing when it neared its end. Behind me, a whisper rolled forward. No words, only shape. The shape of my name without syllables. I didn't look back. I went for the slice of gray light and found it narrower than memory. The cave had shifted, or I had. Stone pressed into my ribs and the pack tried to weld itself to the rock. I shoved and exhaled and thought of everything outside that I wanted. Tea, bright paper, the texture of my sister's laugh when she calls. The flare kissed my knuckles again and guttered, and then it went out. For a second, the dark was total. Then the daylight, dirty and beautiful, widened a fraction, and I was crawling out of a mouth. The forest hit me with 1,000 uncoordinated noises. Jays cursing, something small crunching through leaves, wind fussing at dry grass. My palms hurt. My throat tasted like metal and smoke. I staggered 2 steps from the entrance and bent, hands on knees, like I'd finished some race I didn't remember training for. Behind me, the cave exhaled. The air on my neck was cool again. The smell of honey and rot thinned into mushroom and iron. I waited for a hand that looked like mine to touch my shoulder. Nothing touched me. When I finally turned, the seam looked ordinary, unremarkable as a crack in a wall. I packed in a daze. The stove went clacking into the bag, the empty cup, the useless chalk. My hands would not stop shaking, so I hooked them into the straps of my pack and went down the slope until the map dot caught sight of the cabin again and decided to be helpful. My legs carried me because that's what legs do. At the porch, I fumbled the key and laughed once in a jagged way when it stuck, and then the door was shut behind me and the air was no longer the cave's. I made tea with shaking hands. It tasted wrong. I poured it out and watched the liquid go a dark, cloudy brown in the sink, strands of something white riding the surface like hair. I blinked and it was only tea. The laugh that came up in me then sounded like a cough. At night, the woods outside pressed close to the windows as if the glass were a thin lie. I kept the living room lights on until the bulbs made the room hot, and every time I said something, the little self-comments we make all day, the words you whisper to talk yourself through a task, I waited. In the cave, my voice always came back a little late. It still does. When I forget myself and say okay as I stand to fetch more water, the word comes back from the kitchen doorway a moment later, a shade quieter and kinder, learned by something that listens. When I whisper my name to make it sound like a joke, the joke returns and isn't funny. I put the flare, the stove, the chalk in a box in the back of a closet and leaned a chair against the door like that would matter. 3 days later, when the rain came steady and the woods smoked, I caught sight of something in the bathroom mirror that made me press both hands to the glass. It was only a small thing, a fine white thread at the corner of my mouth, like the filament of a spider web, hanging down and vanishing when I tried to pinch it. I told myself it was a trick of light. I told myself a lot of things. At night, I dream of limestone and spirals, and the dreams are not nightmares. Worse than that, they are invitations written in a hand I almost recognize. When I wake, the taste in my mouth is sweet, and sometimes I stand at the window with my palm against the cold, looking for the seam I know I shouldn't find again. The map on my phone puts a pulsing dot over a green space and calls it a park. It is wrong in the way that the cave's voice was wrong, not in cruelty but in translation. The cave is not a place, and it is not empty, and it is patient. I felt its attention on me, and now, sometimes, I feel mine curve back toward it like a needle swinging true. If I go back, when there will be no stove or chalk. I will not pretend to be careful. I will take nothing that burns. But tonight, I listen to the house breathe, and I say nothing at all, because the quiet in the room is not empty, and something else is learning me, syllable by syllable, the way you trace a rote with your fingers until you can walk it in the dark. The first thing I noticed about the cabin was how the trees leaned in. Not bowed, not bent, leaned, as if they'd been listening before I arrived and simply hadn't stood back up. A car length of gravel separated the cabin's porch from the wall of green. It smelled like damp loam and pine resin, and something faintly sweet, like a cut apple left too long on the counter. I'd come to stay for 3 weeks to house sit for a botanist friend named Marielle, who swore the place was quiet enough to hear yourself think. The cabin sat in a thinning of pines and beech, the forest beyond tangled with brambles and ancient oaks stitched together by moss. There was power, sporadic cell service if I stood on the porch's leftmost step, and a wood stove that made the cabin feel like a chest cavity, warm and ribbed. Unfamiliar places always feel either like a challenge or an invitation. This felt like the latter. I stacked my bag in the bedroom, hung my jacket by the door, and carried in groceries, my steps muffled by the braided rug that smelled faintly of smoke and lavender. Sunlight moved across the floor in slow bars, collecting dust motes. It would be fine, I told myself. I'd read, I'd write, I'd take walks and bend my life down into smaller shapes. By late afternoon, mist threaded through the trees. I took Marielle's map from the peg near the stove, the paper soft with handling, and followed a trail drawn in faded pencil. The woods received me without ceremony. Pine needles cushioned each step, the air cooled. Somewhere distant, a brook made a sound like glass beads clinking together. I walked until the cabin disappeared behind me, and I was a moving hinge of breath and boot sole among trunks, older than any house I'd ever lived in. I was the first to start it. When I turned back, I noticed a stack of pebbles at the base of a beach, 4 small stones, palm-sized, balanced in a cairn. I wouldn't have noticed if not for the topmost pebble, which was blue glass, smoothed by water. It winked in the wet light. It felt like treasure. I laughed aloud at myself for being charmed by a rock and left it there. An hour later, the blue glass pebble waited on the porch railing. I didn't jump, but I flinched inside. The gravel had no new footsteps. The moss verge held my own boot treads and nothing else. I stared at the pebble, and it stared back the way objects do when you've decided to invest them with meaning. "Marielle?" I called, absurdly. The forest breathed. A jay scolded. A game, I thought. The word rose by itself. Some local kid, maybe. Some hiker. It was a glass marble smoothed flat, a worn coin from a creek. I rolled it in my palm, then set it on the porch table where the light caught its heart. That night the trees ticked with insects. The wood stove quietly devoured logs. I read until my eyes ached, then slept with the thin cabin quilt up to my chin. I woke at 2 or 3 to a soft sound at the window. Not a tap, but a pat, as if a palm were pressed there and lifted, pressed and lifted. Not the sharp peck of a bird, a child's testing touch. It came 3 times. I held my breath, counted 10, heard only my own pulse, then stood and went to the window. My reflection peered back, ghost pale, hair a dark shawl. The glass held the cold. Beyond, the forest was a blind wall. I pressed my own hand where I'd imagined the other. The glass shivered beneath my palm, cooling me. "Hello?" I whispered because the hour told me to whisper. The word swallowed itself. The next morning I found small half-moons in the dew along the moss verge leading away from the porch. Bare feet, 2 parallel tracks that vanished where the ground was drier. My mind offered the obvious answer, a deer, a stray dog, a trick of the eye, and then refused it. They were too human, too neat. No one likes being asked to believe 2 opposing truths. I stood there swinging between them and, to break the sway, called out, "Nice trick. You're good." A wind moved through, and the trees finally seemed to exhale. By midday, I decided to lean into the invitation of the place rather than the challenge. I walked the same trail into the pines, listening for water and birds, for the cluck of squirrels. I listened, also for soft feet, sun caught in the high needles, a green-gold ceiling. In a glade where the light fell clean, someone had arranged twigs in a rectangle on the ground with a smaller rectangle at one end, like a simplified house with a door. Inside lay a red ribbon tied in a bow. "I'm being lured," I said, amused, out loud, the way people talk to pets or babies. "Into what, though?" I took the ribbon. It was stiff with the wax of old fabric. When I lifted it, a shape detached itself from the shade of an oak. A little figure, quick as a muscle twitch, darting and gone. Not even a figure, really. A shadow shaped like a child. My throat closed. The ribbon weighed more in my hand. I looked long at the spot where I'd seen motion and saw nothing. But my heart paced itself differently afterward. There are rules to unfamiliar places, rules no one writes down. You make eye contact with neighbors. You don't stray off marked routes. You greet the land the way you'd greet a room full of strangers, openly, but with your hands visible. I set the ribbon back down in the twig house. "Thank you," I said, unsure if I was responding to a person or the idea of one. When I returned that evening, the ribbon hung from the porch light, tied so the tails brushed the glass. Sleep pressed me like a second quilt. At some hour, I surfaced to the sound of a child humming outside my window. A tune so simple I could have made it up as I lay there. 3 notes, then a pause. 3 notes, pause. The humming grew louder as it approached the window, and quieter as it circled away, around the cabin 3 times. The floorboards seemed to flex under my bare feet as I stood. The kitchen clock blinked 3:08, solid then blank then solid again. "Okay," I said to the darkness, to my fear. "Okay, I hear you." On the 3rd day I found the hopscotch grid. It was chalked in white, but not chalk. I bent and touched it, and my fingertips came away dusty and sweet-smelling. Fungus, maybe a pale bloom of it, laid down in squares on packed earth near the cabin's back step. A pebble rested in the first square. In another context, I might have laughed. Instead, I felt a child's old itch to play, a certain sternness to the setup, the way a line of ants looks stern, purposeful, rule-bound. It wasn't just that someone wanted me to play, it was the implication that the game had been in progress long before I arrived. Two can play at this, I said, which is not what adults say when they are being reasonable. I tossed the pebble. It landed with a small, satisfying tick. I hopped, carefully, feeling my body remember 1 foot, 2, 1, 2, around the stone and back. When I finished, I placed the pebble on the porch rail beside the blue glass. The forest answered with quiet, and then with something else. Around noon, I heard giggles in the bracken beyond the verge, real giggles, breathy, stuttered, a budding silence like stones aligned along a creek. I moved toward them and saw a figure flash between trees, small and fast. "Hey," I called, softer than I would have expected of myself. "It's okay." I followed without thinking about how quickly one can be led wrong. The figure had a measurably shorter stride. The prints, where they appeared in patches of mud, were small as my palm. They drew me to a place the map didn't show. A ring of stones around the base of a tremendous beach whose roots rose in ridges like an animal's back. In the ring lay offerings, a pink plastic hair clip, a chipped mug, bones washed clean of their story, the broken arm of a doll. The hair on my forearms lifted. There are places that are rooms without walls. This was one, and the moment I stepped across the ring, I knew I had entered a boundary that expected things of me. The air felt plucked. Sound dropped away. My name came from somewhere behind the tree, spoken as if by someone who'd known me for years and had finally found me again at the grocery store. Not shouted, not hissed, pleased. "Ivy," it said. I froze. Ivy was the name I'd given a friend when I was 6 and had invented one to keep me company in the empty lot behind our building. Ivy had liked climbing the chain-link fence, liked the smell of sidewalk after rain, liked to scrape messages in dirt with a stick and then ask me to answer them by stepping into or around the lines. Ivy had told me not to tell adults about the games. I had not for years, and then I did, and the games ended. I had not thought of Ivy in a long time. I turned slowly, as if turning too fast would tear something in the air. The space behind the beach was empty, except for the ragged shadow where the roots made a cave. "You're not Ivy," I said, but my voice lilted like it wanted to be convinced. "Play with me," the voice said, too near, then too far, like it had been thrown and caught by leaves. "What game?" I asked. "Tag," it sang. I took a single step back and felt the ring of stones edge my heel. Stupid, I thought. Stupid to step into the circle. Stupid to throw a pebble. Stupid to answer the humming with words. But who can resist being known by name? "I don't want to play that one," I said, as if negotiation mattered. Red light, green light. There was a very small silence. The kind that means a child is deciding whether you've given them exactly what they wanted. Then, okay. The forest brightened an imperceptible degree. A sliver of sun slid out. The beech leaves trembled. I set my bag down. The ground waited. "Green light," the voice sing-songed from everywhere and nowhere. I took a step. "Red light," it said, close enough to my ear that I flinched and turned. Everyone remembers the rules. Move on green, freeze on red. But no one remembers what it feels like for the game to become rule, for the muscles to seize not just with effort but with compulsion. On the first red, my body obeyed so completely my breath stood mid-chest. Something watched the stillness, weighing it. A hush spread like water. "Green," said the voice, tenderly. I walked. Red. I stopped so hard my teeth clicked. The third time I saw it. The figure stood where the shade was thickest between two oaks. A child's height, a child's proportions, a dress that might have been made of leaves stitched together by spider silk. No face, or rather a face that resisted my eyes, slipping to the edges of what faces should be. But hands visible, small and dirt-smudged, fingers like tender roots. The right hand clutched a red ribbon. "Green," it crooned. When I moved, it moved too. Not toward me, but sideways like a crab, as if we were orienting ourselves in a circle. I tried to gauge distance to the ring, to my bag, to the path. On red, we both froze. I tried to swallow and failed. Fine, I thought. Two can play at illogic. I'd proposed the game. I had a right to shape its edges. "Time out," I said, the way children say it, demanding amnesty with an upraised palm. Nothing changed. "Time out," I repeated. A slow pressure built around my wrists and ankles, the sense of someone's hands holding, not unkindly, but insisting. I realized then, not too late but late, that the game wasn't mine to shape. It had been taking my offers and folding them into its appetite. My face prickled with a cold so clean it felt like mint. Green, it sang. I moved because it wanted me to. I moved to keep it from moving more. Red. The pressure at my joints eased when I obeyed. The rules were favors then. The rules were bindings for both of us. If I broke them, tag, it said conversationally, and I felt the air stir behind me. I ran. I have never run like that. Not on a road with horizon lines coasting past, not under streetlights, not toward anything, only away. The forest was a metronome of trunks. Branches reached as if to comb my hair. The path, there was no path, opened where I thought I would stride and closed where I lifted my legs. The thing behind me did not crash. It pattered. It laughed at odd moments, a sound like wind caught in a pipe. The rules were simple, but I didn't know them all. I knew, for example, that the ring of stones had been a threshold. I suspected that leaving it had changed the stakes without changing the game. The ground pitched downward. I thrashed through ferns, lost my footing, and slid down into a shallow, dry creek where the stones were slick with a bloom of algae. I banged my knee. The world flashed white and then set again. Green, I gasped at myself and dragged up the far bank. Red came from directly to my right. I froze so hard I thought my tendons would snap. In my peripheral vision, something child-tall leaned near, head cocked. The red ribbon brushed my forearm, and where it touched, heat bit me, hot coal small. "Mother, may I?" I whispered. I didn't know why I said it. It was a game we'd played in the lot. You asked for permission to move, and someone granted it or altered it. "Mother, may I take 3 giant steps?" The thing's head tilted further, like a dog considering a math problem. "You may take 1 baby step," it said, and giggled. The pressure released from my ankles. I slid my foot forward a palm's width. The baby step took all the room I had to breathe in. "Mother, may I take 2 giant steps?" "You may take 0, it said sweetly, edging closer. I had misunderstood the twist for years, apparently. Ivy's favorite part had been saying no. Ivy's favorite part had been keeping me in place. "I don't want to be it," I said, and for the first time I believed I was speaking to the forest, not to a ghost inside it. Not to a child. Something huge listened, something old that had worn a child's shape like a comfortable shirt. "Then don't be," it said, and tagged me on the shoulder like a kiss. The place it touched burned cold. My vision blurred, the trees braided and unbraided. I had the distinct impression of being tall and then not tall, of shrinking until the ridge of roots could be a mountain and a pebble could be a planet. Then I was myself again, gasping, my shoulder a knot of ice and fire. "What do you want?" I asked. I meant, what will end this? "Play," it said simply, and for once there was no slyness in it. The word struck me with a second meaning. Not play as time-killing, play as a state. As in, the way a door has play in its hinges, the way a thing can flex. "What if I can't?" I said. "What if I won't?" It hummed those 3 notes. The notes went wrong in the middle and came right again. "Then I'll follow," it said, almost shy, "until you can." I bolted for the one thing in the world that could make a rule as strong as the forest's: fire. In the kitchen, I ripped open the stove, blood in my mouth from biting my lip, hands fumbling on the iron door. Pine splits lay by the hearth like loaves. I stuffed kindling into the grate, struck a match. Sulfur stung. The flame took in a tiny lick, then a bigger one with a woof that felt like a friend arriving breathless. Heat lapped my shins. My heart stopped trying to break my ribs. The humming came from the porch, then the wall by the sink, then the ceiling. "Red," it said, in a small voice that was anything but. I stood still, then exaggeratedly not still, tossed a log into the stove so it boomed and spat sparks. "Green," I said, and fed the fire. The sound in the room grew ragged, the way laughter becomes a sob when it comes back on itself. At the window, something leaned its head against the glass, and the glass haloed frost instantly. I put the poker in the coals until its tip glowed and stood facing the door. "I want to go home," I said, which is childish and adult both. It didn't answer, exactly. The knob turned once, then again. The door didn't open. The pressure I'd felt at my joints pressed now along the baseboards, in the rafters, a house made to creak. It knew the shape of my days, I realized. It had learned me in 3 of them, where I set the mug, where I hung the jacket, where my boots tapped stepping down. It had the patience to wait me into compliance. "You could follow me," I said into the hush, "but you'll lose me in the roads, in the lights, in other people's rules." A small fingernail scraped the glass, a single comma. But, I added, because I could feel it listening as intently as a child does when an adult finally speaks plainly, if I come back, we play something else. We write the rules together. We stop when I say stop. A long pause. The kind that isn't silence so much as breath held for the count of a wish. Promise, it said, lisping the S as if trying on teeth. I promise, I said, and the word made a shape in the room that felt like a ring of stones I was drawing myself. I don't remember falling asleep. I remember the fire settling into a red-eyed stare and the humming moving farther off, thinner, a lullaby for something that did not sleep. I remember waking at gray dawn and opening the door to find the hopscotch grid washed by dew and the blue glass pebble centered in the first square. The red ribbon lay on the threshold, bowed neatly, as if to say, "We tie this here, between us." I packed and left by noon, because I am not brave enough to see whether the forest honors bargains. The road felt too straight after days of turning. The sky looked too big. At a gas station 30 miles away, the pump clicked on and off and on and off, as if a small hand were playing with the handle. I did not look at the strip of trees behind the lot. I did not chase laughter. I drove home with the ribbon on the passenger seat, the cabin keys heavy in my pocket, and the scent of resin and sweet fungus threaded through my clothes. In my apartment, I slept with the window open, city noise a continuous comforting rush. It was perhaps 3 nights later that I woke to a new sound, a child's wry little giggle in the stairwell followed by quiet feet and the softest pat on my door. I sat up, heart doing its 2-note song. On the welcome mat lay a square drawn in chalk. Not fungus this time, chalk dusty and city gray. In the square was a bright blue glass pebble, smoothed flat so it could pretend to be a coin in any pocket I chose. Beside it, in a child's neat hand that was also a forest-stippled shadow, the word green. You might think I locked the door. You might be right. I did, twice. I also set the blue pebble on the windowsill, where the light caught it, and tied the red ribbon around the curtain, so it made a loop smaller than my wrist. I stood there a long time, listening to the building breathe. The rules of unfamiliar places aren't written down, but some of them follow you. I've learned to sleep by them if I want to sleep at all. When I visit Marielle next month to return her keys, I won't tell her everything. I will tell her the cabin needs more kindling, and the stove draws better if you crack the door an inch. I will tell her the map is soft and accurate, except for where it isn't. And before I leave, I will walk into the trees and stand in the thinning of pines and say clearly, "Red light," and count to 10. If the leaves answer by counting with me, if the wind plays at humming, if the ring of stones is exactly where I remember it isn't on the map, I'll set my bag down and step into the shade. The forest will lean in. That's what forests do. I don't know if I'll keep my promise, not exactly. I know only that something has promised me back, and that promises, like games, are binding because we choose to believe them are. Outside my window now, a flock of starlings turns as one body, a smudge and a glitter, flexing as if there is play in the sky's hinge. On the sill, the blue glass pebble throws a coin of light on the floorboards. The ribbon bows and unbows in the draft from the vent. I can almost hear the giggle in it. "Green," says the evening, as the shadows lengthen into squares across the room. I understand the rules better than I used to. I take one step. I didn't plan to be in those woods at dusk. I meant to take a short detour on my drive home, stretch my legs, grab a few quiet minutes under pine boughs after a week of fluorescent lights and ringing phones. The map app showed a green patch along County 14 with a lollipop loop trail, out and back stem with a tidy circle at the end. 2 miles, tops. Perfect. The gravel pullout was little more than 2 tire grooves and a sun-faded sign with bullet pocks. I killed the engine, and the silence fell like felt, soft and absolute. The air had that cool, metallic edge of October and the resin-sweet smell of sap. In the back, a woodpecker thudded at a rhythm that almost matched my heartbeat. I locked the car, took a photo of my license plate out of habit, and shouldered the small day pack I keep for these things. Water, a headlamp, a cheap emergency poncho, a lighter, a single narrow silver tent stake I once used to pin a tarp in a summer storm and never took out again. A trail ribbon fluttered from a low branch, fluorescent orange, like a tongue. I stepped off the gravel into the shade and the temperature dipped 2 degrees. The ground was a quilt of damp needles. My boots sank without noise. Everything smelled clean and green, but there was a sweetness too, like something fermenting under the loam. The path was narrower than I expected. A deer track, really. It pushed between spruce and young maples, and after a minute the road and the world I knew were hushed into the distance. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. No fluorescence, no slack pings, only the wind talking to the leaves. The trail rose, and I caught sight of pale lichen on a massive fallen trunk like dried seafoam. My breath fogged faintly. I tugged my jacket around my ribs and went on. 15 minutes in, a fork presented itself that didn't match the map in my head. The printed trailhead guide had claimed one path only, out to a loop. But here 2 options yawned. A dark seam to the left, tunneling through hemlock, and a brighter, brush-crowded way to the right, where a few shards of sunlight dappled the ground. I hesitated, feeling an old childhood superstition press the back of my neck. If you stop and listen in the woods, something listens back. I chose right. The way narrowed, and briar tugged at my pant cuff. The sound of the woodpecker returned, closer, and then stopped like a needle lifted from a record. A breath of wind wandered past, carrying a smell like wet coins. I checked my phone. No bars. The blue dot on the offline map wobbled, then slid sideways as if dragged by a magnet. It wasn't reassuring. The path climbed another hump and dropped me into a shallow bowl of ferns, all browning at their tips. In the center stood a cedar with a trunk as wide as a refrigerator. Something had scratched the bark in parallel lines, high up, past where my reach could go. I leaned close and smelled pitch, and for a second I heard a tiny ticking, beetles hidden under the bark, chewing a life I'd never see. Okay, I told myself. My voice sounded grapefruit pulp dull in the air. Loop can't be far. A flash of white flicked between trees to my left. I flinched. Deer tail, I thought immediately. Deer. But when I peered that way, I didn't see the crash track deer make. I saw a birch with its papery skin peeling in curls. Sunlight winked through the layers. The curls lifted and fell in the breeze and made a sound almost like whispering. When I reached the birch, someone had knotted one of those orange ribbons around it. Not just knot, threaded through a slit in the bark, almost careful. The ribbon's end was chewed into fringe. I don't know why that detail made my stomach tighten. Animals chew things, squirrels do that. It's normal. I walked on. The first wrongness I couldn't explain arrived as a stone. It was a simple cairn, 5 fist-sized rocks stacked in a cone, standing in the middle of the path like a question. I paused to look for the second, because where there's one, there are usually more. Trail runners make them, kids, people bored and waiting for someone to catch up. But I saw only trees and a cove of moss that looked plush enough to sleep in. I glanced back the way I'd come, and a second cairn stood there, behind me now, on the path where there hadn't been one before. 5 rocks again, the top one slightly broken like a tooth. I laughed. It was brittle. "All right," I said to the trees. "Very funny." Wind traveled the boughs and a cold bead slid down my spine. Wrong word, not wind. Draft. Like the exhalation of a large room. For a moment I pictured the woods as a cathedral, and then it wasn't a metaphor. I felt the vastness, the quiet, not of emptiness, but of a space that had not yet decided whether to accept me. I stepped over the first cairn and kept going, faster now, as if the speed could keep back a thought that was trying to surface. Dusk arrived without sunset. The light simply thinned to milk. In the distance, a metal creak sounded once, long and lonely. A hunter's stand shifting on its chains, I thought, or an old gate somewhere turning in its sleep. I pulled on my headlamp to test it and flicked it off again. Saved the battery. Back at the car in 20 minutes, I lied to myself. 30 tops. It took me 15 to reach a clearing I recognized. Not from a map, from an earlier life. There was the cedar with the scratch marks. There the bowl of ferns, the same orange ribbon, now tied differently, ends uneven like a tongue cut on an angle. "This is stupid," I said, because speaking made my brain align. I followed the right fork, and I must have looped. That happens. People walk in circles. You correct. You keep one landmark. You walk with one hand on the trees. I chose a bearing, a dead spruce that leaned like a spear, pointing toward the dimmer part of the sky. I put my left hand to bark and moved, making sure to brush trunks as I went. I counted steps at first like an incantation. At 50, I lost count. At some uncertain number past that, another cairn waited, this one newly decorated. A strip of blue like the lining of my backpack, tied around the second stone from the bottom. I didn't stop to think. I swung off the trail and crashed through brush, taking scratches across my shins, thorns pricking my wrists. The ground dropped, and I slid the last 2 feet into a shallow creek bed, where water whispered over stones as smooth as river glass. The creek's sound laced the air in a way that made me breathe easier. Running water meant direction. You follow it down. You find a road. You find a farmhouse with a dog and a porch light, and you explain your foolishness and laugh about it with someone who offers you tap water and a warning about bears. I turned downstream and walked the creek. The water soaked through and numbed my socks. In 5 minutes, I couldn't feel my toes properly. Saplings leaned over the water like polite people at a railing. I imagined the car's key fob heavy in my jacket pocket. Imagined the thunk of unlocking. Imagined the heater wheezing hot air onto my frozen fingers. The imagining warmed me. A light winked ahead, low, flaring, then gone. My heart did that roller coaster drop. Headlamp, I thought. Someone else out here. Hey, I called. Hey, sorry. Little turned around. My words splashed, ricocheted off bark, and came back smaller. Somewhere beyond the next bend, a human voice answered in a lined paper monotone. Hey, sorry. Little turned around. I stopped in the water, and the creek talked around my ankles. I have never been so aware of my own name as in that silent moment where my brain spoke it like a warning. Then I said, ridiculous and firm and out loud, Echo, it's an echo. I took 3 steps forward. The light winked again, quick like someone cupping a hand over a flashlight beam and letting it slip. Can you hold your light steady? I called, because I needed them to be human in a way my mind could file neatly. A beat. Then, quietly, not exactly where I expected it to come from, another voice. Can you hold your light steady? My voice, my exact rhythm. Not like an echo, no interference, no distance, more like a recording played back into my mouth. Something moved in the trees above the bank, just beyond the next curve, a tall, thin shadow slipping behind 2 hemlocks. The birch's peeling curls lifted again like fingers. My skin readied me in a way I couldn't argue with. All the hairs came up, 1,000 needle tips reporting a storm. I reached the bend and found, tucked into the crook of root and rock, a half-collapsed fire ring. The stones were black with soot. Within the ring lay a lid from a tin of beans, rusted and curled like a tongue. Above the ring, pinned to the trunk with a nail, hung a damp Polaroid. The film had browned with age, but kept a bright diagonal of reflected flash. A figure stood in the middle. The only part clear was a hand, middle finger scarred at the knuckle. My middle finger has that scar from the time I shut it in a door as a kid. I reached up and touched my knuckle where the bone rises. The skin there is glossy and pale as a fish belly. My throat felt too narrow. The photo wasn't mine. It couldn't be mine. But the scar was turned toward the lens the way I always unconsciously angle it when I grip things. As if the person who took the photograph had known I'd noticed that first. Okay, I said again. It sounded strangled. Okay, the woods said back in my ragged tone from 3 places at once. Something clicked in me like a seatbelt latching. The fear developed edges. What I thought I was dealing with reorganized itself. Not lost, not exactly. Lured. That tug to look, to step, to answer. I recognized its flavor. It was the same flavor as a spam text that knows your name. It was the same as the way you look up when someone says, "Hey," in your voice behind you. I backed into the creek until the cold bit bone. If you're a person, I called, forcing my voice into the flat, polite tone I use on strangers on the subway, I'm going to keep downstream. If you're not, I'm still going to do that. I'm not coming into the trees. The trees exhaled. I heard a slow peal like tape lifting. A tall, jointless figure leaned out of the shadows just enough that my headlamp, which I'd flicked on without deciding to, grazed its edge. It looked like a man roughly assembled by someone who'd only read a description of one. 2 narrow shoulders, bark for pants, a curve of birch paper curled where a lip might be, and above that 2 ovals of wet darkness full of reflected light. Not eyes, not holes, just blackness that had the quality of depth. It held a flashlight low in one hand, beam pointed up, a way no one comfortable in a forest would hold one. You aim at the ground. The beam stuttered as if dappled by leaves, even when it moved into open space. It lifted its other hand, and the fingers were too many. In its palm lay a scrap of blue fabric. "My pack," I said without meaning to. "My pack," it repeated in relief, delighted, like we were playing a game together, like I had confirmed the rules. It stepped down the bank and the flashlight swung, and I saw inside its mouth, where the birch paper curled inward, an improvised tongue, a strip of bark with handwriting scrawled in pencil. "This way." The graphite was smudged from saliva. I didn't know I was going to do it until I did. I reached into the fire ring, grabbed the rusted tin lid, and thrust it into the creature's face. It flinched. Instinct more than strategy drove me then. I snatched a dead limb from the bank, jammed it into the fire ring's ash, found embers. There were none, but I pretended there were, and the limb became a torch anyway in the theater of my fear. In reality, I struck my cheap lighter and touched flame to the shredded birch curls at the edges of its mouth. They caught with a papery hiss. It screamed, or the forest screamed around it, high and rattling, the sound of a string pulled tight and bowed until the fibers began to separate. The flashlight dropped, beam spinning, and hit the water. The hiss of the quenched bulb was almost comically domestic. Then there were more movements in the trees, 2, 3, 5, shapes clicking like they were unzipping themselves from the trunks. I ran. The creek's stones were treacherous, and my ankle folded once and then strained, a white dart of pain threatening a collapse that would mean everything after. I forced it to hold. The bank rose, and I scrambled up clay that sloved under my nails. Behind me, something moved slow and sure. No thrash, no lost steps, like a sewing needle slipping through fabric. They were not in a hurry. They had time. They had had a lot of time. A gap opened ahead, a corridor of younger saplings, thinner trunks, a pale grade of ground beyond that looked almost level. A road, my brain sang like a hymn. I cut toward it, lungs hot and wide. Something trailed the back of my jacket like a child clinging, and I spun and swung. The tent stake was in my hand. When had I pulled it? I drove it into something soft that wasn't flesh and wasn't wood, and yet was convincingly both. The stake sank in and the thing's body seized hard around it, then relaxed. Sap, pale, opalescent, let go in a liquid rope, and a smell of wet coin and green bleeding filled my mouth. The thing loosened. I tore free. The level ground wasn't a road. It was an old logging track, half reclaimed, summer grass pressed in 2 gentle ruts. But a human machine had made it once, and that fact held. The forest's weave was looser here. The sky's dull milk spilled more freely. I ran the track until a shape reared up, a post. On it, a colder rectangle, a sign. "Do not follow voices. Do not mark your path." I barked a laugh that couldn't decide what species it wanted to be. The irony stung like alcohol. Below in smaller print, "If found here at dusk, walk without stopping to County 14. Do not engage wildlife. Do not engage wildlife." There were clawed gouges and long, polite scratches on the sign, as if someone had touched each letter with a fingertip. My headlamp beam swung past a second sign half hidden in sumac. The paint bulged with weather. No rescue beyond this point. A third hung crooked, a county seal barely visible under lichen. I didn't want to think what happened to the last people who had pounded these in. I didn't look back. The shapes in the trees moved with patience, parallel to me but never blocking the path. They were shepherding me the way a dream shepherds you toward a conclusion you can deny until you wake. Every 30 steps, a voice offered me myself back. "Okay," it said, or "Hey, sorry," or "Bright part of the sky," and once, this made me stumble, tap water and a porch light. It was embarrassed on my behalf, concerned, reassuring. It felt my footsteps and matched pressure so I could feel its hand through the bark of my fear. It had been practicing me. It had a whole chorus. The track kinked left around a tangle of bramble and spilled into a real road, dirt pocked by truck tires and puddled slick. I stopped dead. The night did that trick where it seems to lean in, listening. To my right, in the ditch, a flashlight burned low in the mud, pointed up at the ditch wall. It illuminated a baseball cap crushed into the muck. The cap was navy. There was a tiny stitched fish above the brim. I had a cap like that in college. On the ditch wall where the beam struck, a wet handprint gleamed in clay, the fingers too long. Behind me, the forest arranged the imitations of me into a near-human shape you could almost believe if you wanted to. They stood close enough that I could smell that sour, clean odor of sap, mixed with something like breath that had been recycled too many times through lungs that weren't exactly lungs. The closest one lifted a hand, and there, carefully laid on its palm, was a small curled ribbon of birch. Pencil had scarred it with a message, written in my handwriting, uncanny in its slope and impatience. This way. No, I said, and the word felt like a lungful of new air. I didn't say anything else. You learn not to feed a pattern. I turned left toward the dark that led, if the county signs were not lying, to 14. The first steps took all the grammar out of my body, syntax scattered and recombined. I wanted nothing so much as to run, but some underscore in my bones insisted, walk. Do not trip, do not chase your light into the ditch. They followed a while, testing. Each time my foot slipped on a patch of mud and a grunt escaped me. A grunt came back, shy, obliging. When my breath hitched, a hitch returned. My name rode the air once, shaped by my father's voice, warm with worry. I kept walking. The ditches hummed with frogs. The distinct smell of creosote drifted in, telephone poles. Civilization. My headlamp halo thinned. When the road finally widened and the reflections of red taillights slid along the damp gravel, when the black line of County 14 unrolled in front of me with its white paint and its dull promise that humans ran in straight lines here, I thought I might kneel on the shoulder and kiss the asphalt. Instead, I stepped up, turned off the headlamp, and walked toward the ghostly rectangle where my car waited like something from a life I'd invented and could have back if I pretended convincingly. The woods breathed behind me. The breathing was patient. It had time. I unlocked the car with a shake. The dome light came on, a harsh, plain slice of reality. I slid into the seat and, as if on cue, laughed. It was the gutted laugh you give when the doctor tells you the lump is nothing. I put the key in the ignition and paused, hand on the wheel, because a smell rose from my jacket pocket. A clean smell, green like pharmacy, with an iron edge. I reached in. My fingers closed on something dry and curled. It was a strip of birch paper, the inner side smooth as new skin. It had a lick curve like a tongue. The pencil marks printed there were in my hand, tight and impatient. At first I didn't understand why it felt like reading a note I'd written to myself and misplaced. Then the words arranged themselves because they were mine, and then my stomach did that elevator drop again. This way, it said, underlined twice. There were faint dents on the birch from the pressure of letters, backwards, as if the wood had memorized not only the words but the movement that made them. I thought of the creek. I thought of how sap glowed like a wet coin. I thought of the Polaroid with the scarred knuckle, of the flashlight faced up like a candle at a vigil. The dome light hummed softly in the car. Far down the road, a truck shifted gears. The sound carried clean as a thread. I didn't put the birch back in my pocket. I didn't keep it at all. I set it on the passenger seat like trash from a fast food bag, and then, unsatisfied with the proximity, opened the door and flicked it onto the gravel. It landed white side down with a sound like a matchbox. I closed the door, turned the key, and the engine gave that damp October cough, and then steadied. As I drove away, the rearview mirror caught a glint on the road where the strip lay, a small pale scab in the dark. A shape stood at the shoulder. It looked like a man until the moment I didn't need it to look like one, and then it didn't. It raised its hand, not a wave, a suggestion, a punctuation. At the first intersection I didn't expect, I turned the opposite of what instinct wanted. When I merged onto the highway, the night opened and no trees leaned into it. The radio cackled back to life. A song I used to love came on. It sounded flat and cheap. When I got home, I took off my boots in the hallway and stood there long enough for my neighbor to pass, greet me, and keep walking. I kept my voice inside my mouth like a bird. Later, in the shower, I examined the inside of my cheek where I had bitten it without knowing. There was a crescent there, tooth-marked and small. My middle finger's scar shone like a moon. I slept without turning off the light. At 3 a.m., I woke to the softest sound, paper lifting in a draft. By morning, I found nothing. Of course, I found nothing. Still, for weeks after, whenever I took the trash out, I scanned the hedges for a white curl where something had hidden a mouth. If you're reading this because you found my license plate photo where I left it in the woods, or because a voice in the trees told you you'd find something here, or because something in you wants to hear your own tone of voice aloud, I have no advice to offer that will seem useful at the time. Except this, and I'm not sure it counts as advice. The forest wants participation. Don't give it any more of yourself than the soles of your boots. Do not answer your name when you hear it. Do not mark the path. Walk without stopping until the world becomes straight again. And if you find a strip of birch with handwriting like your own telling you this way, remember that not every message from yourself is a gift. Some are deliveries, some are collected. Some were written with a pencil you did not choose, pressed into bark you did not peel, held gently for you in a hand that has all the fingers it needs.